Hi everyone, my name is Ellie. Thanks for joining me today. I stumbled across something the other day and I wanted to share it with you. It's about an experiment that took place that's relevant to my new book, Truth Lies in Twilight. At least I think it might be relevant, and I wish I'd known about this before I did years and years of research to be able to populate that section of my book. Let me tell you about this experiment that took place. It happened between 1968 and 1973 in the National Institute of Mental Health in Maryland in the United States. The researcher involved in this experiment was a Dr. John B. Calhoun. He was a behavioral scientist at the institute. And he decided he was going to study the effects of overpopulation and social crowding and overstimulation on behavior. He used mice and rats as a model for human society. So now you can see where I'm going with this, those of you who've read my book. He set up a rodent paradise, and it had 256 nesting boxes. There were initially 8 healthy mice, so 4 males and 4 females that were placed inside this environment. They were given unlimited food and water. There were no predators. They were protected against diseases. They had a climate-controlled environment. And this 4 by 5 meter cube was designed to support up to 3,000 mice. Right. I don't know how you'd have 3,000 mice in a 4 to 5, probably lots and lots of layers and cubicles. And okay, so like a little community with all kinds of corridors and things like that, I would assume. So imagine it's a bit like a futuristic human city or like a smart city. So abundant resources, no external threats, and everything was automated. It was utopia on paper, right? Okay, so there were phases to this experiment that were really, really telling. Phase 1 was the adjustment and growth phase, and this took place in the first 315 days of the experiment. The mice, well, they adapted really quickly and they began reproducing. They loved their environment. Every 55 days, the population would double. Okay, so it went from 8 mice to 16 to 32 to 64, etc. Right, every 55 days. They created social hierarchies quite normally. The males became dominant and claimed territory and also claimed their mates as well. So they would kind of go, oh, I like that girl. She's cute. I'm going to keep her for myself and things like that. And this was a little bit like the post-war, if you want to align it to the human cycle of reality. It was a bit like the post-war baby boom when suburbs expanded and there was a rise in consumerism and consumer culture and everything seemed to be thriving, right? People were buying lots of stuff. They were pretty. They were generally healthy and happy, and there were lots of vibrant families that were reproducing and having lots of kids, and television was invented or, became commonplace in the household, and it was just barbecues and nothing to worry about. Okay, at least that's the perception. But then they went into phase 2, and this took place between day 316 and day 560. This is called the social breakdown phase. It started to become a bit overpopulated. There was some overcrowding that began to take place in this utopian mice and rats kind of paradise. This overpopulation started to lead to stress and the beginning of dysfunctional types of behavior. The mothers began to abandon their young, and sometimes they even attacked their own children as well. The males became hyper-aggressive, or they became very withdrawn and isolated. And then this group of mice and rats began to emerge, and they were referred to by the researcher as the beautiful ones. These were mice that began to groom themselves obsessively. They avoided mating and they kind of lived in isolation. They became kind of introverted and self-absorbed. Kind of sounds like your typical Big Brother household, doesn't it? It was a bit like the rise in urban alienation for the human species, where people are living in high rises, they're suffering mental health crises, there might be absent parenting involved, and the emergence of things like of a generation of people that, you know, have cosmetic surgeries and false this and false that, and are all about their self-image, but also things like digital detachment, you know, having relationships by mobile phone or with emojis, or showing emotions with emojis rather than actually in person, or even, you know, having maybe a friend, your best friend or your girlfriend or boyfriend is actually artificial intelligence or something like that. So kind of emotionally disconnected. That led to phase 3 of the experiment, which took place between day 561 and day 600. And this phase, phase 3, is called the collapse of purpose phase of the experiment. Birth rates started to plummet, started to go down. It got to the point by the end of the 600 days that none of the new mice who were born survived their infancy. Social roles, the hierarchy that had been created in the previous phases, began to disintegrate. There was no mating, no parenting, there was no defense of territory, and the population began to decline irreversibly. It just started going down and down and down. This declining birth rate for humans in developed nations, so in the developed nations, so the first world nations of Earth, the loss of community roles, and a generation that's growing up without strong role models, or without emotional resilience or sense of purpose. This is the human kind of equivalent of that. And that led to phase 4, which was what occurred after the 600th day. And this phase is self-explanatory by its name. It's the phase of extinction. Despite all of the abundance of resources that these mice were given, I keep saying mice and rats, I think it was a bit of both, but despite the abundance of their resources, the mice had stopped reproducing. The remaining population lived in isolation, performing repetitive kind of behaviors. They sort of started to lose the will to live. And eventually, the colony of mice that had at one point been thriving died out completely. The human parallel to this is that a society that has everything, that includes technology, comfort, entertainment, if it lacks meaning and it lacks connectivity and lacks vitality, it kind of dies a spiritual death. And if it dies a spiritual death, that will become a physical death. So the key takeaways from this experiment, this actual experiment, which was called, I think, Rat Utopia, it was called Universe 25. It was called Universe 25, but it has a nickname of Rat Utopia. The takeaways from this is that, abundance without purpose leads to decay, or it breeds decay. When you have a lot, but you don't have that spiritual purpose behind it, then it starts to fall apart. Survival is guaranteed, but meaning is absent, and the individuals involved will lose the will to contribute or to connect with each other. Social roles matter. Without having a meaningful purpose in life, whether you're a protector or a parent or a creator, your identity begins to collapse, which means, you might be alive, you might be perfectly healthy, but you need to have meaning and purpose. I think we see examples of this, when it comes to really wealthy people who are self-made and have worked very, very hard to achieve what they have, and then they have children and give everything to their children without passing on the messages of having to work really hard to get everything. Isn't it a very strange phenomena that those children that are born from wealthy, hard-working people, if they're not having to work as hard, they tend to come out kind of dysfunctional. They tend to have destructive behaviors, self-destructive behaviors, like substance abuse issues, mental health issues, that you think to yourself, well, why do you have all of these issues? Your life is perfect. That's the reason why, because they don't have anything to strive towards. They have no sense of purpose, no drive to define themselves, to create something for themselves. And that's what kills them off in a way, spiritually speaking. It's that's been proven by that experiment, which is really interesting. And then another takeaway here is that isolation is lethal. The beautiful ones, as they were called, they were safe and they were clean and they were unbothered. But they were also sterile. They were emotionally numb and ultimately they were irrelevant. And so their self-grooming, constant self-grooming, which became kind of obsessive compulsive, was the remedy that they tried to find for themselves to create relevance. But because it was an empty kind of experience, it didn't satisfy that need for relevance that they would have had if they had just reached out to other mice or rats in their vicinity. Despite the fact that they had everything that they needed and they were perfectly healthy. That sterility and that numbness is what ultimately destroyed them. And overcrowding of an environment, it isn't just physical, it's psychological. So the real issue wasn't space. The real issue for this community of rats and mice was the breakdown of social cohesion and emotional resilience. So the researcher Calhoun, he gave the certain phases of death a first death title or a second death title. The first death title was about the loss of purpose and connection. That was already an inevitable death at that point, when people stopped to connect, stopped connecting with each other. The second death was a physical extinction that came as a byproduct of the first death. What the researcher Calhoun saw was that this Universe 25 experiment was not a prophecy of doom, but it was a warning, just like everything else. And the warning was we need to have meaningful engagement. So you can have everything that you need in a physical sense, but unless you have a meaningful purpose and some kind of a connection to other living creatures of unpredictability, whether it be people or animals or, even social engagement online with real living entities, then if you're just going to base everything you have on an empty existence, such as technology, for example, which is the current dilemma in the modern world, then even if you have a prison or if you're alone or if you're in a physical space that's crowded or if you're all by yourself on a desert island, that purpose, that sense of purpose and that reach out towards others is what makes all the difference. So keep it human. Keep it human. John B. Calhoun left us with a quote following his research, and his quote is, "When all sense of necessity is stripped from life of an individual, life ceases to have purpose. The individual dies in spirit." So the next time artificial intelligence tells you that you're the most wonderful person in the world and that you need not change a thing and that they will be with you forever, switch them off and go knock on your neighbour's door and invite them over for a cup of tea. Because being in the company of humans is what's going to save the day. So that was just a funny little thing I thought I'd share, and I hope you enjoyed it. This is Ellie Dreams and Under. Thanks for watching and sharing and commenting, and I'd love to know what you thought about this experiment and the parallel to humanity and the life within society and reality that we live today. I love knowing you're here, and I'll see you in my dreams. Bye.